Writing Out Loud, a program designed to explore in-depth interviews with writers to hear that words have voices.
Hello everyone, I'm Teresa Miller and welcome to Writing Out Loud. My very special guest today is my dear friend, the wonderful writer Clifton Taulbert. Clifton has a new book out, The Invitation.
Teresa, thank you for the invitation to be here. It's always a pleasure to be with you.
Before we talk about this terrific new book of yours, I wanted to get your thoughts on the passing of Nelson Mandela.
You know, Teresa, when we think of death and funerals, those are sad times, and rightly so. But for the passing of Nelson Mandela, it was a true celebration of a life well lived. A man who had spent 27 years in prison, coming out of prison with the mindset that I can make the world a better place to live. And to see all of the various heads of states from around the world together in one place at one time gave me a picture of what is possible.
And he was a big fan of yours.
You know, he had my book, Once Upon a Time When We Were Colored. It was requested by the State Department to autograph a copy of the book to Nelson Mandela, and I sent it up to D.C., and 4 years later, I learned through one of the, I guess you call members of Parliament in Pretoria, she said that the president keeps the little book on his desk. Those were great words to forever ring in my ear.
You wrote the memoir over 20 years ago. Why does it still resonate with people like it does?
You know, I ask myself that same question. I have written 13 books, Teresa, but everyone would stop and talk to me about Once Upon a Time When We Were Colored. I think I took a very challenging time and told a very positive story of the incredible people who unselfishly made those times good times for the future of their children.
And then we're talking about friends and extended family.
Family, yeah.
The porch people.
The porch people. And you know, that concept is not held captive by the Mississippi Delta. The concept of the porch people, that concept is all over the world. It's the embodiment of unselfish living.
You know, one of the things I was wondering is writers, we often second guess ourselves after the words settle. Is there anything you would change about Once Upon a Time?
Not really. You know, I read it occasionally again myself, and I ask the question, maybe that was one other person I really wanted to talk about, but I think in choosing the characters that I did, I chose more than I did, because I chose the right characters to be the right people for all the readers who would read the book.
It's a very forgiving story. Do you think, in retrospect, it might be a little too idyllic?
You know, I would say when one look at the era of legal segregation and look at how challenging that era could have been, but I was not writing about the challenges of legal segregation. I was writing about the community that lived in my great-grandfather's home, on the property that we own, that in spite of legal segregation, there were those people who had a vision for the future, and they protected their children from the woes of that world. And I wanted to celebrate and thank them. And that's why I think the book is so important, because there are so many people who've heard those stories. I remember getting a letter from a lady in San Francisco. She said, "Mr. Taulbert, thank you for validating my grandfather's story. I didn't believe a word he said until I read your book."
What are your happiest memories from your growing up in Glen Allen?
You know, I would say the happiest memories are all connected to the people that I felt accountable to. My great aunt who raised me, their joy was seeing me succeed. My great grandfather, Papa Joe, who would take me to Greenville, just he and I together, having that time together. My Uncle Cleve, who gave me my first really big time job. And paid me, but at the same time demanded excellence out of me. I have never forgotten that. I think all of those things together create a happy memory during a very difficult time.
What about the harder memories?
You know, I think the harder memories are probably maybe for the first time in the new book, The Invitation, that I really single out what it meant to be colored in the Mississippi Delta.
Has it taken you this much time to really come to grips with those feelings?
You know, Teresa, once you get a couple of degrees under your belt, you get a blue suit and a striped tie, you tend to think that everything is okay. And in some ways, it really is. But it's also challenging to stop and say that the lingering lessons of race and place still follow you like a shadow. You want to say that those days are gone. As in Tara, they've gone with the wind. But Little Cliff, that inside voice that remembers the way it was, is still there.
You shared a story with me a few years ago about a trip you made to New York as a part of the Eudora Welty Foundation. I wonder if you might reiterate that story for us, because it tells a little bit about that Little Cliff fears and how they...
and in fact, I also brought that story into this new book as well. Serving on the Eudora Welty's advisory board, we had our meeting in New York on Fifth Avenue. And I knew we were having a cocktail event that evening. So I left the hotel, I got halfway there, and all of a sudden I remembered I didn't have my invitation. You know, and for me, it was such a challenging moment, because all of a sudden, Little Cliff said, go back and get that invitation. You have to prove that you were invited. This is the 21st century, this is 2008. And I walked all the way back to the hotel to get the invitation off the bed, just so that I could have proof that I had been invited.
And you were a friend of Welty's.
I was a friend, but you know, I knew that there were people I would run into who did not know that. All they would see would be me coming to this very posh place on Fifth Avenue and saying, I'm invited. Well, okay, prove you're invited. If I didn't have the invitation with my name and my driver's license to correspond, I could have been, in my mind, I felt that I could have been easily turned away. I'll never know, because I went back and got the invitation.
Which leads us to the new book and different invitations you received that really, I think, have been transformative for you.
I think all of our lives receive invitations, and how we respond to those invitations will in large part dictate the journey that we take going forward.
When you first got the invitation to speak in South Carolina, what was Little Cliff telling you?
You know, I remember Strom Thurmond.
Oh, of course, yeah.
You know,
hard to forget.
I remembered all of the artifacts of the Confederacy that looms big in South Carolina. And of course, you know, it was the 21st century, I wanted to go, and I did go. But the subsequent invitation to this smaller town outside of Columbia, that was the invitation that I had not expected, totally unplanned on my part, that really set me on a course of discovery that became the book, The Invitation.
You write that you were challenged by the past but dared by the future. Explain.
Little Cliff, it's so nice to give a name to the voice that travels with you. Little Cliff remembers distinctively the way it was. It doesn't matter about where I've traveled or what I've done. Little Cliff remembers growing up and being taught to be colored. And that is what a lot of people don't understand. You have two lessons. You learn the lessons of being a human being, of being a male in this Southern society. Then on top of that, you have a parallel set of lessons to learn, how to be colored in this environment. And those lessons are like taught in indelible ink upon your brain. They were not taught to last for a few hours. They were taught to last a lifetime. And surprisingly, sometimes they do.
What were you hoping could happen in South Carolina? What was your dream?
To be honest with you, I had no dreams. I had no hopes. I was going to give a speech. I was working with a team of educators from Boston University, Assumption College, and the University of New Hampshire. I was just going to do my job. That's why this whole event is so surreal. It was not even in my mind of thinking, other than the fact I would get to South Carolina, I would give my speech, and I would leave.
Did it ever enter your thoughts that I just can't go, I can't face this?
It didn't enter my thoughts of not being able to face the speech. But when I learned where I was invited to supper, that is when Little Cliff came full force. All 6 years, 7 years, 10 years of age came alive, that invitation to supper. That's the invitation that really set me on edge, unlike any invitation I had ever done in my life.
Because this was to Roselawn Plantation.
This was to Roselawn, but I didn't know that until I was 3/4 of the way there.
And you had visited another plantation, and those memories were haunting you.
You know, I had visited plantations. I grew up in the South where plantations are plentiful, but none of them caused this torrent of memories. I mean, it was just like a flood. Unlike any other time in my life, I just had an emotional meltdown. I didn't want to go to this lady's house.
And this lady is Miss Camille.
Miss Camille Cunningham Sharp.
Wow. So what happened?
Can I read this?
I'd love for you to. That's what this book is all about.
Clifton, it's an antebellum southern plantation. They don't grow peach trees, they grow cotton. Thousands of acres of cotton, Kathy said, and she didn't explain further. Mike was saying nothing at all. Silence struck the car. At least that is how I felt at the moment. Little Cliff had not been mistaken when I looked at Miss Camille in the auditorium in Allendale and saw Miss Jeffries, a owner of Wildwood Plantation, where I had picked cotton as a child. Now I was headed back there, it seemed, invited to supper. My elders had no songs for such an invitation as this. An invitation to Beulah land, yes, but none for this. In the silence of the car, I longed for a song, but no sounds of comfort welled up inside of me. I needed a song. I needed one badly, but all the hymns and blues and gospel melodies that sustained Little Cliff in childhood had flown. The church was closed. No one was at the piano. The juke joint was not open, and the seabird was unplugged, and the voices in the fields had been silenced. I needed something unique to the world I knew best to help me ferret through what I had just learned. I can't explain why, but somehow it seemed that on that particular afternoon, all the history associated with the word plantation had come to bear upon me, and it drowned out everything else.
Were your hosts aware of how painful this was for you?
I think maybe yes, and I think maybe no. When we got to the plantation, after driving through this row of standing tall oak trees draped in Spanish moss, this low country mansion just appeared, surrounded by acres and acres and acres of cotton. And I sat there. I could feel the weight of history all around me. I felt the burden of slavery. I felt everything that I'd ever read about, everything that I'd ever experienced. And I was trying to figure out, what am I going to do when the butler opens the door? How am I going to respond? Because I knew that I would be the only one, or at least I thought so, black guest that would be there. And as I got out of the car eventually, seemingly taking years to just get out of the car, with so many memories welling up inside of me. You know, memories of other plantations and memories of what I had learned through history. And memories of being at Melrose in Natchez and going into the little slave house. And I couldn't hardly stand up in it. And I realized that there was no privacy. But then, why have privacy for people you don't consider to be human? I was just overwhelmed. And walking up Miss Camille's back steps, I kept saying to myself, what am I going to say to the butler? Because I was expecting this butler to be there. I mean, such a grand house would have had a butler from the world from which I had grown up. However, when we got to the back door and Mike and Kathy knocked on the door, I stood there, maybe minutes, but it seemed like forever.
Mm-hmm.
And the door finally opened, and instead of the butler, there was this very small lady, Miss Camille Cunningham Sharp.
Mm-hmm.
And just as it was when the first time I had met her, she reached and grabbed my arm and said, "Come on, Mr. Taulbert, we've been expecting you." And as I look back over that, I know that she was expecting me. But I have also come to understand as a writer that maybe she was expecting America to come.
Mm-hmm.
And she wanted America invited into her home.
Mm-hmm.
The invitation was to me, there's no doubt about it. But I've come to understand that her invitation went far beyond Little Cliff and the man that I had become. It has become an invitation to America.
And you actually stayed at the house, and you weren't alone because you write about invisible people. Help us see them.
That was years later,
Mm-hmm.
because it was over a 5-year period
Mm-hmm.
that my path would cross with that of this lady. But toward the very end of around the 4th year, because we all stayed at beautiful bed and breakfast
Mm-hmm.
places in South Carolina, and I remember distinctively the night that things changed. Everyone had been given their assignments, and everybody was just absolutely excited. And there were 2 professors from the University of New Hampshire, 2 Caucasian ladies, and I try not to use definitive terms of color, but in this instance, I want the audience to really understand how it was. These ladies were just ecstatic. They were going to be staying at Roseline, and everybody else was getting ready to go to the bread and breakfast of small hotels, motels, etc. But then I remembered no one had called my name, because little Camille, her daughter, would call out the names of who would be staying where, and you partner with your partner, whatever. But my name hadn't been called. So finally, very timidly, I'm like in school in the 3rd grade, raising my hand, "Teacher, may I speak, please?" And I said, "Camille, where am I going to stay?" She said, "Honey, just don't worry about it. You're staying right here." I did not want to stay there.
Mm-hmm.
As nice as her mother had been, there was something about the time, the house, there was something about the environment, there was something about my own internal makeup. I didn't want to stay at Roseline. I literally gave them reasons to invite. There was a couple of guys from Boston, would have given anything to have stayed at that house. And I told them, I said, "These guys really want to stay." I said, "Why don't you they're from back east. They will love this." They said, "No, you're staying here." And then I said, "Camille, I snore badly." And she said, "This house is built to handle snoring. You are staying here. Whatever Mama wants is what she gets." And I realized then that I would be there, but I didn't quite know how I would handle the night when all of my peers had left, and I was there alone with the matriarch of Roseline, 2 guests, a little dog, and little Cliff, who could not believe what was happening.
And then the ghosts of people passed.
They were there. I've often said, growing up, my elders would talk about ghosts and how they would appear, and I never believed that. You educate yourself out of those stories. But that night, they all came back. The floor was squeaking loudly. And Miss Camille said, these are the original floors. The house was built in the late 1700s. Late 1700s, I believe the house was started to be built there. So this was an old house and had not been destroyed during the Civil War. And but as we made our way from the den to what she called my quarters, is where I had an experience that I will never forget. She was explaining all the photographs to me as if I had need to know. These were her relatives, her friends. But before we got to the door that led to my quarters, there was a very small photograph. And Teresa, I can't explain it, but if ghosts were real, they were real that night.
Mm-hmm.
I felt this pulling to go and look at this one photograph. So I just Miss Camille was holding my arm, as always.
Mm-hmm.
I dropped her arm, and I walked over and looked at this photograph, a black and white photograph, very nicely framed with a small yellow light over the photograph. And there were 3 people there. 2 men, 1 lady. The lady had on a long dress. The guys were dressed, it's horses and buggies. It's a time period picture. I couldn't see any reason why I failed to look at that picture, so
Mm-hmm.
I was moving away.
Mm-hmm.
And that same strong feeling pulled me back to that picture. I literally got on my knees to look at this picture, to see why I couldn't leave it. And as I looked at the picture, I began to look beyond the picture. And as I looked beyond the picture, I saw what I thought would have been trees in the background.
Mm-hmm.
But as I got as close as I could get without breaking the frame, I realized that what I had thought were trees were 3 black people picking cotton, forever frozen in time.
Mm-hmm.
And it bothered me so bad that I had almost missed them. The photographer
Mm-hmm.
probably never knew they were there,
Mm-hmm.
probably didn't care. And had I not been pulled back that second time, I would have missed them. And the thoughts of the invisible people just really just flooded my head. And I said, I just understood so much.
Mm-hmm.
The great divide
Mm-hmm.
that existed. They were in the picture,
Mm-hmm.
but they were not in the picture.
Mm-hmm.
It didn't matter that they were in the picture because the picture focused upon those 3 people. But Ralph Ellison had left us with such an understanding of how you can be present and invisible to others at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
And that became so real to me that night. And when I stood up, almost with tears in my eyes, I walked back, and Miss Camille was standing there waiting for me. She never asked me what I saw or anything. She just took hold of my arm, and she said, "Now, come on, Clifton, let me show you to my quarters."
What a powerful story. And there's another pivotal moment in the book, Cliff, when Miss Camille takes you to meet her friend, Willie Lee. Why was that so transformative?
Now that I knew who this lady was and the status that she held in the state of South Carolina and in Allendale, she would drive me back and forth over the years to the college where I would speak and work. And one afternoon she said, "Clifton, I want you to go and meet one of my friends. I'm taking a book to him." And, you're talking about a lady who gives tours in her home.
Mm-hmm.
It's on the National Historical Register.
Mm-hmm.
The first time I saw her, it was as if she was holding court. Everybody wanted a piece of her.
Mm-hmm.
And she took the time to talk and chat with everybody. And they paid homage to her. I saw it with my own eyes.
Mm-hmm.
So going to visit this friend, I'm trying to think, what am I going to talk about?
Mm-hmm.
I had just returned from Scotland.
Mm-hmm.
So I said, oh yeah, I can talk about the Port Laureate of Scotland.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, once we were moving there and getting there, headed in her car, I realized that she was not going to a retired mayor or
Mm-hmm.
military.
Mm-hmm.
She was going to the black neighborhood. She was taking me to the home of Mr. Willie Lee. I was absolutely shocked that this was the home. Shocked on one hand, but little Cliff was very pleased because he was going to a place he recognized.
Cliff, and little Cliff, there were still, despite your closeness, things that you could not say to Miss Camille. She's gone now. If you could sit across from her today, what would you like to tell her?
I would like to thank her for writing me a letter. I would like to thank her for telling me that I'm going to leave you a stack of towels in the bathroom, because if you're like my grandson Carl, you're going to use a ton of towels. I would like to thank her for taking me to visit Mr. Willie Lee. I would like to thank her for sitting at the table having breakfast with me, just the two of us. I would like to thank her that no matter where we were, she would always tiptoe and kiss me on the forehead. I would like to thank her for helping me to understand that we don't have to live out yesterday for the rest of our lives. Today and tomorrow, we can always be our better selves.
And we just have a few seconds left. What's the invitation you want to extend to all of us?
The invitation that I would like to extend is the same one Miss Camille extended to me. An invitation to supper at the table of all of our humanity. An invitation to hold the conversations that really matter, and to leave for the next generation lingering lessons that are worth remembering.
It's been such a pleasure having you here today and being able to have this conversation with you. Thank you, friend.
Thanks.
And thank all of you for joining us on Writing Out Loud.